In 1987, in fact in December of that year, I was appointed to the Supreme Court of Ontario. I was appointed to that court directly from having been for the previous 12 years a law professor. I think some of my colleagues might have been a bit surprised to see someone like me arrive on the court. I think I was the third woman appointed to the highest trial court in the province of Ontario. The Ontario Court of Appeal in my days was a very strong court, both in commercial and in criminal matters. So it was, and I thought I would probably spend the rest of my life there. In 1996, I was appointed the Chief Prosecutor of the International Criminal Tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and for Rwanda. Something that not only did not exist a few years earlier, but honestly something I didn't think I would see in my lifetime, let alone serve on these tribunals. As you know, since the Nuremberg trials, there had never been any other effort or opportunity to set up an international criminal mechanism of accountability for heads of states or military political leaders involved in severe violations of international humanitarian law, the laws of war, genocide. I got a call from then Boutros Ghali, who was at that time the Secretary General, who put my name to the Security Council. And I'm pleased to say that the chair of the Security Council, who oversaw my appointment, was Madeleine Albright. I thought this was going to be a kind of laboratory of international law and the development of criminal law principles. Of course, I'd been a judge, so I thought trials. What it was, certainly in the early days, in my days, it was 90% investigations, not trial. It's over 20 years now, and the idea of accountability at that level of power is still very much a struggle. So I still feel that what we invested in this enterprise was very worth it, but we still have a long way to go, I think, before it delivers on its promise. In 1999, I resigned from my position as prosecutor for the tribunals for the UN because I received a call from the Prime Minister of Canada indicating his intention to appoint me to the Supreme Court of Canada. In my office in The Hague with the UN, I had lawyers from all over the world, really, a lot of Europeans, and of course, many American attorneys. All my colleagues from Europe thought this was ridiculous, that I would quit what they considered the best job in the world, prosecuting war criminals, to become a judge. For them, a judge, it's not a big deal. My American colleagues understood that if you're offered a seat on the Supreme Court of your country, you can't turn it down. I was the first law clerk to become a judge of the court. And then in 2004, I received a call from the Secretary General of the United Nations. At that time, it was Kofi Annan, whom I had known very well in my work with the tribunals. And he asked me to come back to the UN to become the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And even though I understand it's very unusual to resign from the Supreme Court of Canada, I did, after a lot of deliberations and agonizing over the issue. So I became the High Commissioner for Human Rights. My tenure as the High Commissioner for Human Rights, 2004 to 2008, was a very challenging period for the international human rights movement and for the United Nations. Largely, I could be very candid, because the United States was not at that time as much a solid on-board partner for this enterprise as it had been historically. I think the war on terror put the U.S. in a position to really challenge existing norms, such as the Convention Against Torture, norms that were not always respected, but accepted at least as the applicable standard of behavior. So it was a very difficult time for the United Nations. It was a very difficult time for human rights defenders and human rights advocates when one of its biggest champions was now, it seems, questioning the merit of the foundation of the century of civil and political rights. So transforming the Human Rights Council and creating what is called the Universal Periodic Review, which means every member state of the UN is put under scrutiny, not just the so-called rogue states. I think it was a very important transformation of the system. So I went back to the UN for a couple of years, basically to assist the UN member states in developing what became the Global Compact on Migration. Even though I was not a specialist in migration, I was very concerned. The so-called crisis on the doorstep of Europe, starting in 2017, was putting a lot of strain, this time on Europe, which was having a lot of trouble living up to its lofty human rights ideals, turning back refugees, seemingly incapable of integrating in a continent of 500 million people, the million knocking at its doors. And the anticipation of climate change was likely to produce an increase in human mobility, not all of it voluntary. So I think it is one of the challenges of our time. We've been very nimble to deal with the movement of capital, the movement of goods, but when it comes to the movement of people, it poses a lot of different challenges. The concept of justice, I think, was best expressed, it's the way I think of it, by, strangely enough, a 19th century cleric who's also a journalist, a preacher, an advocate. And he said, between the rich and the poor, between the strong and the weak, between the master and the servant, it's freedom that oppresses and the law that sets free. To me, there is no other way to capture what justice is about. I'm extremely honored to receive this accolade. I think there's nothing like recognition by your peers. So the fact that you're bringing me back to my academic roots and the association with one of the greatest jurists in the United States, a woman for whom I have a lot of admiration. Well, I think Justice O'Connor was, by any measure, a trailblazer. I feel very humbled and very honored.